On a side note, I like to talk about mercenaries in the Greek world. Epikoros, allied fighters, or better yet, Misthoforos, wage earners as they were called, were a fundamental aspect of warfare and militaries in the Greek world. The role of mercenaries was very telling from the names. They were soldiers for hire, ready to fit the role, otherwise reserved for the citizen soldiers of the polar system. For as important as the ideas of citizens maintaining their autonomia by taking up the mantle of the soldier to keep their eleutheria intact, in reality, the burden of farmer levies abandoning their farms, paying for their own equipment, and risking their lives was often too great. Here is where the soldier of fortune stepped in. Not being farmers, patriots, nor amateurs, mercenaries held a special place in society, as they held no ties to the land they fought. The homes were often far away, and sometimes they could be fighting against the polis of their homeland. There is a famous Spartan saying, said to departing hoplites, "Return with your shield or on it." Now, Achillicus, a famous mercenary poet, once remarked, "Some Thracian is waving the shield I reluctantly left by a bush. A flawless piece. So what? I saved myself. Forget the shield, I will get another. No worse." Mercenaries in the Greek world probably started in the Archaic era as Ionic raiders and pirates, peoples from Attica right through to Ionia on the Anatolian coast. In the 7th century, these raiders extended their range to start raiding the areas of the Levant and the Nile Delta, bringing them to conflict with the Egyptians and the Assyrians. They wreaked havoc on the coastline, but the Assyrians and Egyptians had a counter. They started hiring them. Their combat abilities so exceeded that of the local cavalry and light troops that one pharaoh, Psammetichus I, founder of the 26th dynasty and a usurper general himself, hired them as garrison guards, auxiliaries in the military, and eventually as personal guards. Likewise, the Assyrians hired those that they captured. Over the next centuries, these Greek mercenaries became more prominent across Mesopotamia and grew in influence. Generations of Greek mercenaries saw themselves employed by the Egyptians, even going so far as to involve themselves in the civil wars on the side of usurpers and founding colonies throughout Egypt. Greek mercenaries even saw themselves involved in the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II, defeating the Egyptian armies that also employed Greek hoplites. In this period, it largely seemed that most Greek hoplites were involved abroad than in any domestic war. The life of a mercenary enticed many on the fringes of society. Exiles, those unwelcome by their home polis, the impoverished, criminals, etc., many of whom enlisted as mercenaries came from the Peloponnese, specifically Arcadia and Achaea. These areas were notoriously poor and hit hard by the ravages of the previous century of wars. Others who enlisted from across the Greek world, however, sometimes came because of their specialized skills. Some regions were of special notoriety for the specialized units. Of note, the Thracians and Paeonians were famous for their agile peltis and were numerous. The Rhodians were the greatest slingers and trained in the art since childhood. And the archers of Crete, who were notorious for their range and accuracy. However, they had to be sanctioned by one of the polises in order to leave. One of the greatest changes with the increase in mercenaries was the evolution from their role as auxiliaries, a part of a greater army, to consisting of an entire army altogether. Mercenary armies would consist of cavalry, peltis, and heavy infantry units ready to deploy for the right price. The greatest example of this new mercenary army is the 13,000 strong hired by Cyrus II to seize the throne of Persia from his brother Artaxerxes II. Their famous retreat from the heart of Babylon back to Greece is detailed in Xenophon's Anabasis. However, the sheer ability to hire such a force radically changed the influence mercenaries would have in Greek politics. With the rise of mercenary armies came the ever-growing prevalence and success of the commanders who led them. In the time of the 4th century, many men, noble or otherwise, rose to great fame and prestige as the leaders of these mercenaries. Of these men included Timoleon of Corinth, who championed the Greeks on Sicily against the Carthaginians, and Iphicrates of Athens, who managed to crush the Spartans on the field of Lycaeum and largely reformed the arms and tactics of Peltis. With such experience in combat fields across the Mediterranean, these mercenary captains could experiment with military tactics and equipment with their troops. And so, innovation in Greek militaries were tied to what these mercenaries brought back with them. For example, it's largely thought that the evolution of hoplites was mainly through the adoption of foreign arms and techniques, like the adaptation of the single group Assyrian round shield into the hoplon shield with the Argive grip. However, the real bane in the increase of mercenaries was the issue of their payment. Payment was the main drive of these men to fight, and it was not unheard of for them to switch sides in the battle or desert if they were not paid. Thus, with the prevalence of these mercenary armies, their costs got larger and the amount of people who could afford them got smaller. So they had to seek other means to get their pay. For example, Iphicrates from beforehand allowed his men to plunder, friend or foe, the lands where they fought, and fixed any supply issue with piracy. Due in part to this ruthlessness, these Mistaphoros were usually despised by the local inhabitants. There were xenos, foreigners, coming to their homes to disturb the peace and wreak devastation on their lands. Naturally then, most Greeks were hostile to them, often barring them from the major policies. This hostility was well deserved, it seemed, as the ability for those who were opportunistic and rich enough to raise such a mercenary army would, one day, lead to the seizure and then the robbery of the sacred treasury at Delphi, thus kickstarting the Third Sacred War. Mercenaries in the Greek world were a double-edged sword. The sheer experience in a range of situations and battlefields allowed them to experiment and innovate in the fields of military tactics and unit equipment. The opportunistic nature of mercenaries allowed for vertical mobility unseen in this era of oligarchies and monarchies, allowing even the lowliest peasant to rise to great prestige as a captain. However, this same brutal opportunism would lead to the ruthlessness that they would become infamously known for. Their sheer numbers too, later on, would magnify this greatly, but at the same time, without them, the Greek ability to colonize across the Mediterranean would have fallen flat, and many a time would they have been subjugated by foreign powers. Greek mercenaries were the unwelcomed heroes they never knew they needed. I want to make a special shout out to Jeremiah and Isamar and their new son Octavian. Best of luck, and I see many Caesars in your child. Additionally, I'd like to thank all of you that have sent me mail. I really appreciate it from all you guys. Also, I want to mention that we now have a subreddit, r/IKEA so be sure to check that out. New videos will be posted there and discussions, that sort of stuff. Finally, thanks for also hitting 500 subs. It's not huge for YouTube standards, but for me it's pretty big. Yeah, you guys have been awesome. Thanks.